Can we just
And
remind everybody to switch their cameras off
yeah,
and mute?
if you could switch your cameras off and mute your microphones, otherwise any sort of noise or dogs barking as they come in, or residents clattering by noisily, is all sort of gets in the way of everybody else's sort of hearing it. So we'll start. So really big welcome to people participating today in this webinar, which shouldn't feel like it's a lecture. If it does, I get it wrong. It should feel like somebody, myself, Dr. Mike Scanlon, who's worked an awful long time in mental health and well-being, and I work with an awful lot of people who are experiencing grief, and I'm ably accompanied by the wonderful Susie Dion here, and Susie just makes sure that everything works. But also Susie has such a lot of experience of health service and all of these sorts of issues, so it's, you know, Susie's just a great help in every way. And today's session, oh, my pleasure, Susie. Today's session is a sort of reprise, actually, of a session that I did for the frontline COVID NHS workers a little while ago. Their title wasn't nearly as slick as yours, or as good actually as yours, but essentially we were looking at this problem of, you know, how do we cope amidst all of this really scary stuff, but also how do we cope amidst issues of grief and bereavement, and how do we also help those people around us who are losing loved ones. And today's session is really looking at both of those sorts of issues, but mainly what we're going to try and do is I'm going to take you through a piece of work that talks about a mindful acceptance strategy, an approach to how we can actually look after ourselves and look after the people we care for who are also grieving in a really practical, useful way. When we finish, I will send the recording over probably to Phil McCarthy, and but I'll also send a series of films that I will allude to as we go through. And these are films that kind of help you if you want to use some of the exercises that we'll look at today, some of the strategies, that we have a film for most of those. And so I'll send over the film details so that you guys afterwards can actually start to use some of the approaches with yourselves and maybe with some of the people you work with. But I think the films might be most useful for yourselves, but some of it might help some of the residents and the clients you work with. My plan was to work through this session until about 4:45, and then at 4:45 I was going to shut up. And if you've got questions, or if you've got points you'd like to make, or if you'd like to clarify anything, use the Q&A function on the webinar. If you sort of play with your cursor, you'll see it there. And if you want to send, or if you really don't mind us seeing who you are, and maybe others seeing who you are, use the chat function. I don't think there's anything here that anyone needs to be particularly confidential about, but I'll leave you to decide that. So 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A and see if there's any particular questions that we might be able to help answer for you. So thank you for that, and let's get going. So helping the bereaved and coping with our own feelings is what we're sort of looking at today. And I wanted to start, and this is our main slide. It's a busy slide, but this is the most important slide. And we only actually, I hope you'll be pleased to hear this, have 4 slides. I know at this point, Susie will be kind of like cheering that we haven't got a million slides, because sometimes I do put too many up. But here we go. The context. So without a doubt, I think we're in one of the scariest, most difficult times that humankind has probably ever gone through, at a global, at a national, at a local and at an individual level. And probably nobody, and I really mean this, in the country has had it as tough as people working in care homes. And initially, there was such a lot of, I was called in to do all of these webinar series with the NHS staff. And curiously and sadly, I suppose, the first time that I've been asked to do any work with care home staff. And I think that almost speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the way this whole pandemic has been perceived at a governmental and at a societal level. But what we are seeing now, loud and clear in many countries, and very much so here, is that if anybody's on the front line experiencing this with real kind of, I imagine, terrible fear and lots of grief and lots of sadness and lots of very complex emotions. And so I just wanted you guys to recognize and to hear me I do get it. And at a more personal level, someone I'm really close to had one of their mother in a care home here in Northampton. And the care home was hit so hard by COVID-19. And she'd been visiting her mum for sort of 5-6 years. And she'd got to know a lot of the residents as real friends, and she was close to some of the residents. She didn't work there, she visited, and she was absolutely poleaxed, floored by the sense of grief and the sense of sadness. And that she described a sort of sense of people dying too early as being a real difficult, conflicting emotion that she had to deal with. And I remember speaking to her about it, and she was saying, and the staff, the staff that care, and they go way beyond what is expected of them on their job descriptions. And I think this is a real truism, and they're really struggling as well. So that's what today is about. And I just wanted you to, I have no idea, truthfully, how you must be feeling, but I can only guess from my own responses and from people that I am close to who have lost people. And I wanted to be clear there. So, you guys are the experts. I'm just going to take you through something I think might be helpful. So this model is a model of effective living with grief. And that's quite important, actually, grief and bereavement, because it's not saying we have to make this stuff go away. It really isn't. I don't want to be feeling this grief anymore, because that kind of isn't going to work. And it's a really unhelpful way for us to try and deal with grief, because if we push things under, and we keep pushing things under, and we try not to have emotion, and we try not to have feeling, and we do that too much, then what happens is it's a bit like a pressure cooker. And if we imagine a pressure cooker and we're just shoving more and more stuff in, and the heat is getting up and up and up, and when we cram that pressure cooker just too full, of water, eventually it all starts to seep over the top, or we get a bloody great poof, don't we, explosion. And we don't want that in you guys. And one of the ways that this occurs is because people try really hard, and they say to themselves, I can't afford to grieve, or I can't, I can't even think about this stuff. What I'm going to suggest today is it's much healthier, actually, to gently lean in towards the feelings that we're having and to meet them with a degree of curiosity. So we start this model with the values, purpose, and meanings. And this isn't about us having any goals, because goals don't work with grief, and goals don't work for people who are bereaved, because there's something disrespectful, I think, about saying you ought to be over this by now. Why ought I? If somebody matters to us and people's lives matter to us, the grief process and the bereavement process will take the time that it takes, you know, and that's really important. So this model suggests that if we can retain a degree of mindfulness, if we can maintain a degree of connection with the stuff in our lives that really matters. And what we find, science tells us from a therapy approach called functional contextualism, there you go. Functional contextualism, lots of scientific writing there, really looking at what are the core values really that most people have. And if we can maintain a grip on what really matters to me as a human being and not lose sight of that because of what we're going through, then that in itself can be a huge buffer. And what I mean by that is that sometimes when we're feeling grief and we're feeling sadness and when we're bereaved, what we try and do is our brain does this thing which is like, it's actually called emotional numbing. And our brain tries to help us by making us feel a bit sort of emotionally numb. And the problem with that is that when we get home to our families and the people that care about us, if we're not aware that that numbness is with us, we don't reach out to the people we love. We don't still laugh and enjoy our families. We get invitations from friends to catch up on the phone or on a Zoom like we're doing now, or to take a distance walk or something along those lines. And we find ourselves saying, oh, just no, I can't. And actually, I think this is about, well, if that friend really matters to you, if that member of your family is important to you, then you are also important to them. And what we need to be doing is remembering that and recalling that, because living our lives close to what matters is one of the most powerful ways of coming through a really difficult bereavement or a really difficult grief response, as many of you guys, I'm sure, are experiencing. So what we're looking at there is sometimes it's just this ability to bring a bit of mindful awareness to, you know, am I living my life, grieving though I am, in touch with the stuff of life that really matters? So here is film one. So what I'm going to send to help is a process called BOLD. And most people just love BOLD. And BOLD works like this. What we do is we quietly make a promise to ourselves that, do you know what, I'm going to try and be more mindful about me being the me I want to be. And the way to do it is we take the word B, the letter B, and we say, okay, B stands for take one mindful breath. And we need to do this 4 or 5 times a day. So I envisage this, that you busy shift, lots and lots of struggle going on, lots and lots of sadness, lots of fear. And we find ourselves sort of charging about our workplace, not taking our breaks, not looking after ourselves properly. And then we remember, oh, I'm supposed to do a BOLD every time I have a meal, and I've just had a snack. So I'm going to do a quick BOLD. One mindful breath. And then we ask you to move into what we call the observing self. And the observing self is where I just envisage one of you guys, you almost sort of sit back and you look at yourself and you say, how are you doing? You know, how's things going for you today? And so you really do a sort of mindful check-in and you look at yourself. And then the L of the BOLD is lean in. And what you're leaning in towards is you're leaning in and making a judgment, really, not a judgmental judgment, but you're making an assessment, I suppose, of, do you know, is that the me I like? You know, the way I've been behaving today, the way I've been responding today, is that the me I want to be? And then the D is very simply make a decision. And I know that I had to use this a few weeks ago. I did one of the COVID-19 NHS webinars for the frontline staff. And afterwards, when we did the Q&A, I was quite shocked actually at hearing some of the stuff they told me. And I went out and my daughter was out and she was chatting away to me. And I was quite short and grumpy with her. And she said, "What's wrong, Dad? Why are you being grumpy with me? I've not done anything." And in that moment, I had stopped being the Mike Scanlon I want to be. And I was allowing the sadness, the bereavement, the difficulty to pull me away from the stuff that really matters that we see there. And so what I did, and I should, shouldn't I, because I teach this stuff, I went and did a quick bold. And when I did that bold and I leant in and looked, I thought, no, that was a difficult session, but I don't need to take it out on anyone else. Make a decision, Mike. Just go back and say, sorry about that. I was a right grumpy so-and-so, wasn't I? You know, yeah, no excuse. Back to being Dad again. So good. So I'll send that film, because if we can start to use a mindfulness in this moment technique, which that one does, then it's a really great way to deal and to allow ourselves not to be too affected more than necessary by grief and by bereavement. And with our care home residents, we can actually use something similar. We can just stop and say, okay, let's just check in with ourselves. Are you being the person you want to be today? Are you behaving like the person you want to be? And now make a decision. So we can use a version of it with the people that we work with, depending on their ability to cognitively manage some of this stuff. But as I know with you guys, you'll be very, very well able to flex some of the stuff I'm doing to meet the needs of your clients. And the second one here is so important actually, because this next one, we're going anti-clockwise, is not getting too far ahead of ourselves psychologically and not finding ourselves too far back either. So if you imagine the brain for a moment, and we'll use something for this, and when we're in a place of grief, sometimes what we find ourselves doing is getting into that thing where we keep wondering, God, how long will I feel this way for? Do you know, I can't afford to still be feeling this way in 3 months' time because I've got a wedding, or I can't keep feeling this way because I'll never manage. In essence, what we're doing there is our brain is leaning forward. And if you imagine yourself standing upright, solid, straight, static, and if you lean forward too far, we feel wobbly, don't we? And sometimes we fall. And the brain is exactly the same. The brain likes to be presently aware. And if we find ourselves looking back at this terrible time that you guys have been with, but not choosing to look back, but finding your brain sort of dragged back and looking at decisions that were made, looking at sadnesses, looking at people that we've lost, and not going there respectfully to think about this wonderful person. And you know, I'd like to think about them a bit because they were special, but finding ourselves dragged back and stuck in difficult, hard emotions, that too, the brain hates. And so as long as we are choosing, isn't that important? Choosing where our brain wanders, and mindfulness helps us to do this, then we can be in this present moment. And the importance of that is that if we're not in the present moment, we go home and there might be people there that can make us feel better. There might be people there that are pleased to see us. But if we're spending too much time there or there, we don't even see that stuff. So being in the present moment, and one of the really useful ways to get back into the present moment is to use this skill we call pivoting. And it's literally, you do what you did then. So if you find yourself thinking too much about the future and about what's going to happen, which, as I said, the brain hates, you just sit upright and you lean forward and you notice, okay, this doesn't work for me. It feels a bit uncomfortable. Leaning forward makes my breath a little bit shorter, actually. So now, pivot back into the present moment, because looking forward, worrying and panicking about what might happen just doesn't help. So take myself back, take myself back, take myself back. Back in the present moment. Okay, how's this? Well, it's still not great, but actually I'm coping, I'm managing, and yeah, I'm okay, I'm managing, I'm all right. And this is better than finding myself stuck in the future. So I'll also send a film of the pivoting process, and pivoting is a really nice way to just get ourselves back into this present moment. Now, the next part on this model of effective living with grief is such an interesting one, because it's about being willing to accept that, do you know what? This is really, really tough at the moment. And instead of fighting it and being angry about it and getting into a place of struggle about it, it's just accepting, do you know what? Someone really important to me died. Someone that really matters to me died. So I've got to be willing to accept that this is going to be a tough, tough time. And I'm reminded actually of a really useful old story, which I'd just like to share with you. It's an absolute peach. And I nearly fell off my chair the other day. I was watching The Big Bang Theory, and they did a version of this story, and I thought, how dare you? That's mine. Of course, it isn't. It's an age-old story. So the story goes like this. So there's this king, and he's the king of this kingdom, which is being assaulted at all levels. There's threat, there's difficulty, there's danger, there's stress. And the king can't stand it anymore because he feels so unsafe, and he's watched all of this sad, terrible stuff happen. So he says to his courtiers, right, bring me the wisest people in the country. I want some help. And they all come to see him, and he says, right, I want you to give me a present, a gift that will help me no longer feel so bad about everything that's happening. And they all go away, and some of them bring him kind of jewels, and they bring him gadgets, and they bring him all these expensive, wonderful things. And he looks at them all and says, well, that's not going to help. Call the old wise woman, the wisest woman in the kingdom. Had to be a woman, didn't it? And the wisest woman in the kingdom comes along, and she gives him a bit of a shabby little gold ring. And he says, I've got gold beyond belief. He says, what do I want with this? And she says, just look at it, sire. Put it on and look at it, and it will help. 2 weeks later, he's feeling worse than ever, and he's angry now. And he says, bring that old woman back, he says, and if she can't explain why she gave me such a useless gift, he says, I'm going to have her beheaded. He's not the nicest of kings. So the old woman comes back, and he explains to her how cross he is. And she says, sire, did you look at the ring and the inscription on the ring? And he says, well, no, not really. She says, well, do it now, sire. It'll help. And he looks at it really closely. And when he looks at it, inscribed on the ring is these words, this too shall pass. Yeah. And do you know what? With grief, the sadness, the difficulty eventually does begin to pass. And there's no point fighting with it. What works is to be willing to accept that this is respectful and right that I'm in a place of struggle. And to fight with it is going to exhaust me. So I need to sit with it and allow and be kind to myself and to the people around me. The next part of this model, I'm just going to have a quick check to make sure I'm going to time, and I am. The next part of this model is about thoughts, because when we're grieving, we can't half be struggled by guilt thoughts. Very often quite unpleasant, difficult, critical thoughts, maybe even shame thoughts. And I'd just like to reassure you there that good people, kind people, the sort of people you want around you, they're the people that do experience feelings like guilt and sometimes shame and feel the difficulty of loss, precisely because they are good, kind people. You know, a psychopath feels no guilt, feels no loss, feels no shame, but good people do. People with empathy and warmth do. The problem is sometimes is that our thoughts sometimes become terribly, terribly difficult. And one of the really useful techniques is to learn to sit back and to be able to kind of find that thought that's just cropped in that says to me, you let that person down. Because that's a very common one I'm coming across at the moment. You know, you should have been there more for them. You know, you didn't do enough for that person. Now, when a thought like that comes in, if we connect to it and we let it in, it's like sort of taking something really prickly and uncomfortable and swallowing it. It just sits there, doesn't it? And just letting those thoughts in is so unhelpful. And I'd like to suggest a really useful strategy for this. And it's a 3-stage strategy. And again, there's a film for this one. And this is the way it works. So let's say there's been a thought that keeps on coming into your mind, and you keep on finding yourself fighting or struggling with it, that says, you could have done more. I get that thought sometimes, you know, when I work with someone and they don't get as well as perhaps I would like them to. You could have done more. And what you do is you stop, and rather than push that thought away, or rather than reason with it or try and argue with it, you just stop and you say this, right at this moment, I'm having a thought that's telling me that I could have done more. And then we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. A few moments ago, Mike Scanlon just noticed that a thought was trying to convince him that he could have done more in that situation, trying to make him feel bad about that as well. Okay, I see that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And it's a new moment now. The old moment has passed. So right in this new moment now, Mike Scanlon is just recognizing that his brain had sent him a thought that really wasn't helping, telling him that he really could have done more and trying to make him feel bad about it. Who's the boss here? Who's in charge of the thinking in this Mike Scanlon human? Well, it's me. And I'm not buying into that thought anymore, because it is just words and pictures. Now that process there takes a little bit of time. Another way that we can perhaps look at these difficult thoughts is by using some real skills that you guys will use all the time. So if I ask you to imagine that a bit later on today you get a text, and the text comes from your bank, and you look at the text and it's got all the logos on it, and it looks very much like it's a text from your bank, and that text says to you that it warns you that your account has been hacked, and that the money in your account will disappear, and your mortgage payments will be robbed, and your pension rights will be lost because a hacker has managed to get into your account. And the message you get warns you that you must immediately send your security information straight away back to the bank, to this text. How many of us, and I'll bet all of you, let me just check how many we've got in today. Yeah, all 19 of us, I imagine, are going, I'm not doing that. No, God, no, never, never, never. I would not send all of my security information, because this is probably someone sending me a spam or a phishing text trying to rob me of all of my money. I'm not doing it. So what happened there was this words and some pictures came through to us. We looked at them. We felt a twinge of anxiety and fear for a second, but then we used our critical thinking skills. We used our common sense. We used our memory. We used our knowledge of ourselves and the world. And we said, not a chance. Someone's trying to spam me. Now, may I suggest that when your brain sends you a thought like, you should have done more, or this is your fault, or nobody cares, I think we can sit back. And if we don't want to do the right at this moment approach, we can sit back and we can curiously ask, do you know what? I think the brain is trying to spam me here. And I'm going to meet this spam in the same way that I would a text from the bank. I'm going to look at it, use my critical thinking skills, and I'm going to come up with the answer that is truthful and fair, especially when it's about me. Because, friends, I can tell you, over the years, the one thing when I work with people with grief, the thing that above all others really impacts on them is buying into and believing the negative thoughts about ourselves and about what we should, could, ought to have done that our brain sends us, that keeps the grief going, that makes us struggle. And maybe we can do a couple of exercises with our residents along this same line. How many of you guys would immediately believe if you were sent a message telling you that you must leave all of your money immediately? Most of them, I imagine, might see that I wouldn't do that. Well, why do you believe a thought then? Do you see where I'm going with that? And the last two is, and this is sometimes quite a difficult one to get your head around, but essentially what it's saying is there are two very difficult selves and one particularly difficult self. So the difficult self is what we call our perceived self. And when people have dealt with something like COVID-19 and we've experienced the level of grief and sadness and difficulty, and it's just been such a difficult time, that we can find ourselves believing in this very negative view of self, and it's classic stuff like, I just wasn't good enough, I just couldn't do enough. And it tends to be very negative and very self-blaming. And that, if we can look at that from the other self, we've already been to this self once, haven't we, guys? The observing self again. So we have the perceived self, which is nearly always negative and difficult. And then we have the observing self, which is when it's a brilliant self, which is when, if we remember, it's a bit like praying, actually. When you pray, you sometimes pray and you move into your observing self and you look at yourself and you just maybe pray to be forgiven. You might pray for more guidance, but you're almost looking at yourself as part of the praying process. And so the observing self is a great one to be in more. But the best self during difficult times and during a grief process is self in actuality, or the actual self. So the perceived self tells me I'm useless. Not interested in the perceived self. What does my actual self tell me? So right at this moment now, I've just finished dressing and caring for one of our residents. I've just finished being enormously kind and patient with someone. Okay, so what's my actual self like then? Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah. So, it's finding that actual self. And sometimes to find the actual self, we have to step into the observing self to see us as we really are. And the bold is very good for that, really good. I will send a film of the cognitive diffusion as well. We've got a new one for that I've just made. So I will send that one over. Susie's sitting there, I think, saying, Has he really? He didn't tell me about that one, but I just haven't quite got round to sending it yet, Susie. So we do have that film as well. So I'll send all of these, and they are really very simple, very easy to understand, and actually very useful explanatory films saying this might help. So there's a series of resources to accompany today's film. And the last one is committed action. And this is that one that says to me, do you know what? I have been through the toughest time. I am experiencing terrible, terrible loss, but I am going to make a commitment to myself that my way out of this difficult period is to be true and to make a commitment to be the best me I can, you know, and to stick with that, but not to be judgmental and cross if I fall by the wayside occasionally, because, you know, we all do. So I think if you were to try and encapsulate that diagram, it calls it the psychological flexibility, which is about choosing the way I'm going to respond to grief and responding in a way that really works. But the other one there is self-kindness, isn't it? It's kindness and it's compassion for the people around us and for ourselves. And if we can find that, then we'll come through this grief process, this difficult period, so much better. I'll just double check. And if you've got questions or anything that you want to put and you want to go into the Q&A and stick anything up there, please do. But we're gonna, before we get to the Q&A, I'm just going to take you through, and we're just going to do one meditation that I think is the meditation of choice, and that's the URL. So that's the sound file for this meditation. But what we'll do is we'll send over that as part of the with the films. So this meditation is one that has helped me through grief times, and one that's helped me through many difficult times. And it seems to work by really giving us a greater sense of strength and feeling powerful and strong and capable and present. And it's a lovely, lovely meditation. And so I can't see you guys, but I'm going to suggest that what we do is we just stop for a moment and see if you can picture a mountain in your mind's eye. And this is a very evidence-based meditation that we've been using for about 60 years. Think about that. And it comes from the great John Kabat-Zinn, the sort of father of secular mindfulness. See if you can find a picture of a mountain. Just find that. And if you can't, look at the mountain on my screen, Mount Fuji, and just get a sense of it. And now let's just close our eyes and let's have a go at this very helpful meditation. So we just close our eyes and we take a breath, a lovely mindful breath where we breathe in and a long breath out. And we just congratulate ourselves for taking some time to look after ourselves. It's important and it's good. Then we stop and we just recognize that we're sitting here and we can feel the chair perhaps against our back and the seat. We can feel that as well, and the feet beneath our feet and the ground beneath our feet. We can feel that. That's good. And then we bring up that image of the mountain in our mind's eye. And we look at the mountain and we look at the lofty peak of the mountain as it reaches up into the sky. And we make ourselves look a little bit more dignified and strong by just elongating our spine and our neck just a little bit comfortably. Yeah. And then we notice the slopes and the sides of this massive, impermanent mountain, you know, that sits there permanent and doesn't move. And we get a sense of our shoulders, our chest, and our back. And we look at the absolute massiveness of that mountain and the sense that this mountain will still be here, as massive as it is now, in 1,000 years. Strong. And we get a sense of the roots of the mountain, rooting it into the earth. And we push our feet down on the floor because we're becoming that mountain as I speak now. So we get a sense of ourselves as that mountain. And we bring our body now, and we bring our attention to our body, and we find that lofty peak in our shoulders. And we find the sides of the mountain in our arms and our hands and our chest and our back. And we find the core of the mountain in our core, right in that base of our tummies. And we notice that we too are rooted in this present moment now. And we look at the mountain in our mind's eye, and we notice that that mountain, although it sits there undaunted, very permanent, it too is buffeted by weather. So when winter comes, our mountain is attacked by the wind and the hail and the snow. But it sits there knowing that the weather will change, just like our emotional weather will change. And winter moves, doesn't it? And spring comes, and the mountain changes. And the fauna on the mountain changes, but the core strength of the mountain stays the same. Maybe we're like that too. Grief happens, difficulty shows up, but maybe we can stay strong. And then we find with this mountain meditation that spring turns to summer, and the mountain is baked hot and becomes dry and dusty, but it sits there through the heat in the sun. And before we know it, it's autumn and winter again. And although the seasons change, our mountain doesn't. Now let's find that physicality of the mountain. Imagine walking into work tomorrow or onto your shift later and finding that sense of, do you know what? Stuff will happen, but I'm strong, I'm capable, and we become our own mountain. And that mountain will come out the other side of COVID-19. Strong, mindful, and in each precious moment. And let's just sit with that sense of the mountain and find that inner strength that comes with it. And make a commitment to ourselves that, do you know, I'm going to use some of this stuff because I'm going to need it to come out the other side of this difficult period, because this too shall pass. And when we're ready, we just relax and come back to the room. And thank you to those of you who were just able to somewhat suspend belief sometimes with meditation, isn't it? But I hope you found that as useful as I always do. And so we move in our webinar to this bit. And please, guys, I'm not sitting here thinking you have to have a million questions. That's not the way this works. I'm just hoping that the questions or any comments or any thoughts that you have, I can actually answer. So I'm just going to go into the chat function. And yeah, Phil's just said thank you, and that was great. And yeah, the film can be used as many times as you want, Phil. That's absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. I think I'm just here just waiting to see. And if people do have any questions or any thoughts or anything you think that Susie or I can help with, given the presentation we've just done, please do just get onto that chat function or the Q&A. And or you know what, if you want to unmute yourself and ask, I really don't mind. We don't normally, but there's only 19 people in. So if you feel happier just to unmute and ask a question, I think I'd be okay with that. Would that be all right, Susie?
Yeah, no, that would be fine.
Is there any slides you'd like to see again or anything?
There is silence.
And there often is at this point, isn't there? So we'll just give it a minute or so. And oh, there's something come in on the chat. Please, Catherine, please could I have a copy of this presentation and videos? Of course. I'm hoping Phil will be okay with that. And Anna's just came through to say that was really good and beneficial. Thank you so much. Oh, it's St. Anne alumnia. Sorry, my eyes aren't as great as they once were. Faye, thank you very much. Thank you, Faye. So what we tend to be getting through is I will send the copy of the presentation and the videos, and I'll send the recording of that last meditation. I might send a couple of recordings over, and Jacinta liked the visualization as well. It's a nice one, isn't it, Jacinta, that mountain? And it so works that. And when I go into a difficult meeting, when I was still in the NHS, I'm back in the NHS a bit now, but when I used to go into difficult meetings, I always used to take the mountain with me, you know, and people would never know that you were having a place of struggle. But more importantly, it made me feel strong. So I guess, is this a question? Oh, Susan, I love this question. How does the idea of accepting feelings fit with negative thoughts being unhelpful? I think what a great question. And I think that one there is that if we can accept feelings, you know, we can see negative thoughts as being unhelpful. And if we accept that they're unhelpful, the process I took you through is about not wrestling with them to sort of turn them around like you would with classic cognitive behavioral therapy, but stepping back from them and saying, do you know what, if this thought doesn't serve me in any way, doesn't help me, doesn't make me feel good, it robs me of my happiness, I don't want to think it anymore. And so I'm not going to fight with it. I'm just going to let it go. And if it comes back, I'll let it go again. For me, that works. And for many people, that works beautifully. Some people much prefer to go in and look at the thought and find evidence that it's not true. Once you've taken the power out of it, it's much easier to do that too. Deborah's saying, where can we access when I send the recordings? I'm sending the recordings to Phil McCarthy, and I think Phil will probably make sure they get out to everybody, because I don't have a copy of the list of people. Laura says, thank you, Mike. As a mindfulness practitioner, that was great. Would very much like to see the recordings. Yeah, I'd love to share them. Another mindfulness practitioner, how great. Love it. And thank you for the time. It was encouraging and engaging. I hope it was useful. Thank you very much, everybody. And
we've got Phil on screen now.
Yeah.
Oh,
I was just going to say hi, Mike. Thanks so much. That was really great. And if you send the recordings and stuff to me, then I can distribute to the various member charities. So
okay, I'll do just that.
Okay.
And please feel free to just use the recordings as you like. That's great. So I've just noticed one of my really noisy daughters has just come charging in as usual. And so she won't be quiet now anyway. It's almost impossible for her to be muted. So I'm just going to say a big thank you to everybody for allowing us to come and do this session today. It was a real privilege for me as well. And as always, a huge thank to Susie and Phil for kind of working together to get this session going. So go out and enjoy the sun if you can get a moment. And thank you all very much for your participation. And I'll send the film over. It'll take about probably tomorrow, Phil, if that's okay, because I just have to upload it and everything afterwards. Okay. Bye-bye now.
Thanks to everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Mike.
Susie.
Thanks, Susie.
Thanks, Phil. Bye-bye, everyone. Put your tongue away.